Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Henry V Act 4, Henry V Act 4, and particularly we're going to be looking at humanism. Our focus is still, of course, conflict, but this is a philosophical idea that is prevalent through all of Shakespeare's work, not just Henry V. And I thought that it would be good for us to look at it in relation to Henry V Act 4 because Henry's journeys through the common soldiers really highlights part of the philosophy of humanism. So today, if you find anything particularly interesting from the lecture, I highly recommend checking out on Britannica.com their article on humanism. It's very accessible, but still has a lot of detail, and it looks at the different ways in which humanism has manifested through time. So today, in this lecture, I'm going to take you through what humanism is, just a very basic introductory understanding of it. We're going to appreciate how this applies to Henry V Act 4, and then we're going to link the core concept of humanism to conflict. Okay, so kicking us off here, what is humanism? Gaining an understanding of humanism. So throughout human history, humans have been interested in themselves. Early cave paintings obviously depict humans and animals, and we're interested in the human world, both the human world and the non-human natural world. And a lot of the time, what makes the human animal distinct from other animals? Humanism says that humans are at the center of the universe, that humans are essential, and that we get our meaning from being human. Not from being made in the image of God, not from being different to animals, but being uniquely human. For a long time in art, particularly in the Western world, the human form was not considered something worthy of study. And so on the right there, we have Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And the Venus de Milo there is obviously in a human form. The goddess has been anthropomorphized. And this was common in the very early Renaissance and before the Renaissance era as well, in sort of the 1500s, that if you wanted to paint the human form or even depict the human form, you had to depict a god who had been anthropomorphized, or a goddess who had been anthropomorphized. When we shift into the Renaissance proper and what we call the modern era, it's really typified by the fact that humans become worthy of study. And we see that on the left there with the Vitruvian Man. So previously, if you wanted to draw a naked man or woman, they had to be a god. But then the Renaissance comes along with humanism and says, actually, the human person is worthy of study, particularly in art, but also in literature, as we'll see. A thinker named W.D. Falk has this to say. He says, in the main, humanism is a view of man as the center of the universe, as a creature who can and does find his ultimate ends, that's his ultimate meaning, in himself as a natural organism, who, for knowledge, puts his money on his powers of reasoning and observation, who directs his life on his intelligence and will, who won't uncritically submit to authority, whether of tradition or state or church, who thinks of man as the maker of his fortune, thrown on his own resources to shape it out or bear with it. And it's just this little bit at the end here, man as the maker of his fortune, that I want us to focus on. Humanism is a philosophy that says humans are important. The Renaissance is an artistic movement that says that humans are important. And there was also something happening economically during the late 1500s and early 1600s, which was the rise of the mercantile class. And no longer did you have to be landed gentry, someone who owns land, in order to make money. These people were traveling far and wide. They weren't just stuck to one place. They were learning lots from their travels, and they were making lots of money. And so the gap between the wealthy, the nobility, and the ordinary people, the merchants, was closing. So we had this philosophical idea of humanism coming through. We had this artistic movement of the Renaissance and also this economic movement, all three things happening at once to drastically change what the world looked like. And so one thing that it changed, one thing that humanism really challenged, is this idea of the great chain of being. Up here we have God enthroned in heaven, then we have the archangels all around him, then we have the other angels, then we have men, animals, animals of the sea, mythological animals, plants and rocks and minerals, and then down here we have hell and the hellish. And within man, even within this strata, there was a sense that there was the kings at the top, then the nobility, then the church, and then the merchants, and then the ordinary people. Okay, and what the merchant class really did was it started to say, well, maybe we can move up the chain of being. Maybe we can go from an ordinary person to a very, very rich person and a very, very influential person. And so the great chain of being tries to make a hierarchy of society, but humanism tries to flatten that hierarchy slightly and tries to say, well, maybe there's something that all people have in common, whether you're part of the church, whether you're a king, or whether you're a common soldier. Maybe we all have something innately human about us. Okay, so it's this way of looking at the world, that we're all human. Humanism in a nutshell is one, putting human beings and other living things at the center of our moral outlook. So saying that it's humans that determine what's right and wrong and good and bad. Seeing the world as a natural place and looking to science and reason to make sense of it. And then promoting and supporting human flourishing across all frontiers and championing human rights for everyone. And it's this third point that really started humanism, with humans studying logic and reason at universities through Europe. Okay, so our second part of the lecture today is going to be looking at how these ideas of humanism apply to Henry V, Act 4. And if you've read any summary, or indeed if you've actually read the play, you'll know that these gloves keep coming up. Here are some gloves from the early modern era. And basically what happens in the play is that King Henry walks among the common soldiers to see what it's like to be a commoner, a very humanistic idea. He runs into a young soldier, or old soldier, I'm not sure, named Michael Williams. They get into a bit of a fight about whether the king's a good bloke or not, without Michael Williams really knowing that he's talking to the king, and they decide to give each other a glove. And so they will know each other if they see each other again, and they will continue the fight. That's the idea. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. But let's just have a look at how Shakespeare tackles this question of what piece of work is a man, which is another quote from his plays. In King Henry V, King Henry says to Michael Williams, "For though I speak it to you, I think the king is but a man as I am." So he thinks the king is but a man, is just a man. This is, of course, complicated by the fact that he says, is just a man as I am, because he is the king, and he is saying the king is just a man like I'm a man. But he's saying he is the king saying that. So that's a little bit complicated. When we get to Merchant of Venice, it's a little bit more simple. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions. So here the character of Shylock is saying that it doesn't matter what your cultural identity is or what your ethnicity or religion is, we all have hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections. It's the famous, if you prick us, do not we bleed speech. And then in Hamlet, which is the apotheosis of humanism and humanistic philosophy in Shakespeare's work, says, your fat king and your lean beggar is but variable service, 2 dishes but to 1 table, that's the end. So in this, Hamlet is discussing the fact that in the end we all die, and in the end we are all going to be eaten by maggots. And so whether you're a king or you're a beggar, it doesn't matter, because we all suffer death, and that is the most human thing that happens. And so we can see that this idea of what it means to be a human is common through a lot of Shakespeare's work. He comes down on this idea that we are all masters of our own destiny, that this is something about what it means to be human. In Henry V, he says, "The king is not bound to answer the particular endings of his soldier, the father of his son, or the master of his servant, but they purpose not their death when they purpose their services." So saying that a king isn't responsible for how his soldiers die. A father is not responsible for what happens to his son. Ultimately, we're masters of our own destiny. And it's something that he picks up on in Julius Caesar, which I think was written just before or just after Henry V. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's around the same time. And he says, men are at some time are masters of their fates. That men are masters of their fates. It's a huge idea that we control our own destiny. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Okay, so he's saying that even though we're meant to, in this instance, even though we're meant to follow Julius Caesar, Brutus, we ought not to follow Julius Caesar, that we are masters of our own fates. And of course, John Green picks up on this really famous quotation in his book, The Fault in Our Stars, that it's not fate's fault, it's our own fault if things happen to us. We are masters of our own destiny. Which is complicated in King Henry V because King Henry expects fealty. He expects people to submit to him. He says every subject's duty is the king's, but every subject's soul is his own. And the distinction between duty and soul here is a little bit nuanced than we might think at first. That we ought to do what the king commands is our duty, but our soul, whether we go to heaven or hell, whether we're morally right or wrong, is our own responsibility. But if the king orders us to do something that is morally wrong, should we then obey the king? It's an interesting question that Henry V as a play throws up for us. If we have a look here, let me just adjust that for us. Okay, I think that's better. If we have a look here, it says, if we are marked to die, we are enow to do our country loss, and if to live, the fewer men the greater share of honour. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. By Jove, I am not covetous for gold, nor care I who doth feed upon my cost. It yearns me not if men my garments wear. Such outward things dwell not in my desires. But if it be a sin to covet honour, I am the most offending soul alive. So here Henry's saying that whilst we can't all be rich, we can all have honour. And so that is also something that is common to all of humanity. We must all die, yes, but we can all win honour, whether we're the lowest of low in the army or whether we're the king. Let's have a look over here and let's come back to the gloves. Apologies for that one. Let's come back to the gloves. So here we have the depiction of Henry V in his disguise, and Michael Williams says to him, Your Majesty came not like yourself. You appeared to me but as a common man. Witness the night, your garments, your lowliness, and what your highness suffered under that shape. I beseech you, take it for your own fault and not mine. For had you been as I took you for, I made no offence. So here, at once, Michael Williams's speech says that the king was just like a man, and all it took was for him to change his clothes, and he became like an ordinary man. And yet, he still draws a distinction between the king and ordinary men, saying, I beseech you, take it for had you been as I took you for, I made no offence. Okay, so if you were actually a common soldier, then the way I treated you wouldn't have been offensive. But it was offensive because you're the king. So at once he says, the only difference between a commoner and a king is the clothes. But then he also says that kings ought to be treated differently to commoners. And so we can answer that question in our own time. What does Michael Williams's excuse teach us about appearances and reality? So in our last sort of couple of seconds, we want to link these core concepts of humanism to conflict, okay? And the one way that we can go forward with this is to read the King's internal conflict at Act 4, Scene 1 from line 203. In the next little clip, we're going to look at how we can use that as a basis for a teal paragraph about conflict, and we might even include some of the information we've learned from this lecture on the idea of humanism. So have a look at the next lecture for that information.